Please be seated, everyone. I think we assured you at some point yesterday in the proceedings that the courtroom was considerably smaller than the room we have been involved in up to date, so now you can see it for yourselves. So, as I explained to you yesterday, we're going to begin the trial now with opening statements of counsel. I remind you that the statements that the attorneys make is not evidence, but this is an opportunity for them to explain to you what they believe the evidence in the case is ultimately going to show. It's not a time for argument. It's a time for a discussion by them of what they believe this case is about. So the state will be proceeding first. They bear the burden of proof, as you've heard in this case, so they will be entitled to go first. So, Mr. Burling, please proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. And Your Honor, at this time I would move for a separation of witnesses. I don't believe we have any in here, but just for the record.
That is granted. If anyone out in the gallery believes they are going to be a witness, you need to leave the courtroom at this time. Seeing no one, you may proceed.
And to incorporate the indictment into my opening statement.
So granted.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Back on March 25th of 1993, a woman named Cheryl Jenkins and her friend Wendy Sweeney were out delivering papers on their paper route. They were out in Thompson Township on Sidley Road at around 9 o'clock in the morning. And as they were driving down the road, they saw what they first thought was a baby doll laying in the road. They turn around and come back to take a closer look. And when they get out of the vehicle and look at what they thought was a baby doll, they realized this was actually a human child, a real human child, who had been run over by a car. Looks like maybe animals had gotten to him, an arm had been ripped off, a leg had been ripped off, skin across his back had been torn off, showing his organs. So Cheryl and Wendy contact a nearby homeowner who called the police. You're going to hear from Cheryl about what she remembers seeing that day. So the sheriff's office responds, and you're going to hear from Chief Scott Neas, who's the current police chief, but back then was a detective with the sheriff's office. And Chief Neas documented the scene with pictures. So as we talked about in jury selection, you will see a picture of the child as he was found in the road that morning. But Chief Neas accompanied the child to the local hospital where a formal declaration of death was made. He then followed that child's body to the Geauga County coroner's office, where ultimately an autopsy was performed the next day. Further, after the autopsy is done, several days later, Chief Neas decides, he's going to go back out to the scene, just look around for any further evidence. And he finds about 1/8 of a mile from where the body was found in the woods, a garbage bag. And upon closer look, it appears the garbage bag has been torn open, and inside that garbage bag is a smaller clear bag that contains a reddish watery substance that he presumes to be blood. So that garbage bag and the bag inside are taken into evidence, ultimately also sent out to the Geauga County coroner's office for preservation of evidence. Now, Chief Neas stays at the sheriff's office until 2014 when he becomes the chief of police, and during that time there are multiple efforts in this investigation to identify a suspect. Nothing ever comes of it. And so when Chief Neas leaves, it's still an open, unsolved case. Next, you're going to hear from Dr. Joseph Philo, who is the Chief Deputy Medical Examiner at the Geauga County Medical Examiner's Office. Now, the autopsy in this case was performed back in 1993 by a man named Dr. Challoner. Dr. Challoner has since passed away, but Dr. Philo has taken over the case. He has reviewed Dr. Challoner's findings. He's reviewed the autopsy report with photographs. And he's done his own analysis of some lung tissue slides that were taken of the one remaining lung in the infant's body. And based upon that, he agrees with Dr. Challoner's findings that the child was born alive because there is evidence that the child was breathing on his own. The ultimate conclusion of cause of death that they come to is undetermined violent cause. You're going to hear from Dr. Field that that means, while they can't say exactly sure what the ultimate cause of death was, it was not natural. It was not a situation where the child was born with some birth defects that would have rendered him either stillborn or caused him to die soon after birth. He didn't have an infection that would have killed him. He was an otherwise healthy baby boy. And either some action or failure to act in just doing general care for the child is what caused the death of that child. Finally, you're going to hear from Detective Donald Seaman. Now, Detective Seaman took over this investigation in around 2018. And again, still no leads on anyone at this point. But Detective Seaman had heard about a process that was used to identify a killer in California, where DNA was sent to a lab where they processed it and then inserted it into one of these publicly available online databases where people can trace their genealogy. So he thought this was an opportunity for us to maybe try to trace back who the mother of this child was. So that's sent out to a place called Parabon Labs, and they returned to him a list of identified people who are very, very distant relatives of the child. And unfortunately, this is a publicly available website called GEDmatch. You don't have to put in your real name. You can just use usernames. There wasn't a lot of help from the results that he got back. But there was one name that appeared to be a real person, and it had been submitted by a man named Vern Holden, who I believe lives out in Colorado. And so Detective Seaman spoke with Vern Holden, got his assistance. He was very into genealogy. And then Detective Seaman on his own did an extensive investigation of birth and death records and compiled a family tree of about 1,400 people to try to trace back the individual that was named in that GEDmatch result back to see where it meets up with the child in this case. Ultimately, after extensive investigation, he narrows things down to who he believes might be the grandparents of the child. And in May of 2019, he goes out to that residence, speaks with the individuals, and based on some comments made by them, he then gets a search warrant for the DNA from Gail Ritchie and her husband. Several weeks later, he goes out to speak to Gail Ritchie. And upon approach, he asks her if she knows what this is about, and she says it's about a baby who was left. And she comes back to the sheriff's office for a full interview. And during that interview, she admits that back in 1993, she was pregnant. She says that she didn't tell anyone about it, that she was very heavy, so no one knew. And she says that by herself, she gave birth to a baby boy in the bathroom. She then took that baby boy and put him in a garbage bag. She took that garbage bag and put it in the trunk of her car. And she doesn't remember if it's a day or two later or a couple weeks later, but she ultimately dumps that child in the woods. She had gone to a camp that was close by where the baby was found. She says that she was going out there for some type of retreat, and on a break, she just drove somewhere and dumped the baby. They take her DNA. It's sent to the lab. It confirms that she is the mother of the child who the community has come to know as Geauga's child. It confirms that her now husband, Mark Ritchie, was the father. And it also confirms that both her DNA and the DNA of the baby, Geauga's child, matches the blood and fluids that were found in that garbage bag. So, Ms. Ritchie has been charged with aggravated murder and murder. And the state has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that for aggravated murder that the defendant did purposely and with prior calculation and design cause the death of another. And for murder, that the defendant did purposely cause the death of another. So we're going to be asking you to please pay close attention to the testimony that you're going to hear during this trial. Pay close attention to the exhibits. And again, as we talked about, these photographs that you will see of the child in the road and the autopsy photographs, they're graphic and they're disturbing. But they are necessary for the state to prove its case. Dr. Fila will be walking us through a number of those photographs and showing you what significant portions of the child's body he looked at and Dr. Challoner looked at when they were making their findings of a live birth. And at the end of the case, you're going to go back in that room and you're going to deliberate, and we are going to be asking you to return a verdict of guilty on both counts. Thank you.
Counsel, are you ready to proceed?
Yes, Judge. Thank you.
Please do so.
Good morning, everybody. Let me tell you what really happened 29 years ago today that brings us into this courtroom. Back in the summer of 1992, Gail Ritchie was known by her maiden name, Gail Eastwood. She was 22 years old. She was living with her mom, her dad, and her younger sister in a small bungalow-style home in Lyndhurst, Ohio, where she grew up. She was active in the Lyndhurst Baptist Church. She was the director of the church's youth group. She was working full-time Monday through Friday as a nanny, watching two young children for a couple that lived in Shaker Heights. She was in a dating relationship with a man by the name of Mark Ritchie, who would later become her husband. Sometime in the fall, September or October 1992, she realized that she had missed several of her periods. That prompted her to go take a pregnancy test. And that pregnancy test was positive. And she knew that. But there was a part of her, a big part of her, that simply couldn't accept it. She could not accept the fact that she was pregnant. Not mentally, not emotionally, not subconsciously, not physically could she come to accept that she was pregnant. She never received any prenatal care. She never wore any maternity clothes. When she took the pregnancy test, she had no idea how far along she was in her pregnancy. She had no idea when her due date would have been. She never told anybody that she was pregnant. And nobody saw Gail as pregnant. Not her parents, not her sister, not the people she worked for, not the people at her church. Nobody in the community ever saw Gail as pregnant. And neither did Gail. And then one day, in late February 1993, either a Monday or a Tuesday, she went to work at the home of David Cantor and his wife Mary Ellen, the couple that she worked as a nanny for. They lived in Shaker Heights, Ohio. She would go there Monday through Friday, typically get there at 7 a.m., make the kids breakfast, see the oldest off to elementary school, drive the youngest to preschool. Just another day. And when the sometime 11:30 or so in the morning, as is typical, she goes and picks up the youngest child from preschool, who is only half a day, comes home, makes the girl lunch, as is typical. The girl would then go upstairs for an hour and a half or so of quiet time. And Gail felt the need to have a bowel movement. So she went into the half bath just off the kitchen, sat down on the toilet, felt the urge to push, and less than 30 minutes later, birthed a stillborn baby. The baby didn't make a sound. The baby didn't move. Still attached, the umbilical cord, the placenta, all came out of her all in one big push. She was scared. She had no idea what to do. She went into the kitchen, she grabbed a few rags, cleaned up as best as she could, got a black garbage bag from underneath the sink, put the baby, the body, the placenta still attached to the umbilical cord, all in the bag, took it out to the trunk, put it in the trunk of her car, where it remained for the next several days, till later in that week, when she drove several high school age girls that were part of her youth church group out to Geneva, Ohio, to Camp Koinonia, where there was an annual weekend church retreat. And she took the opportunity to whisk away when the opportunity presented itself. She drove a few miles into some rural place in Geauga County that she had no idea where she was at, parked her car, walked the bag that had the stillborn baby's body and placenta a few hundred yards into the woods, left it there under a tree, went back to the retreat. Some 31 or 2 days, depending if it was that Monday or Tuesday later, the body was discovered. And that's what really happened 29 years ago that brings us into this courtroom. You're going to hear testimony that this is a photograph of Gail on the right at her younger sister's high school graduation from Brush High School, where Gail graduated as well. You'll hear testimony that this picture was taken in the summer, June of 1992. No doubt a month or so before she became pregnant. And you'll see that it was, again, no clearly established time when she first became pregnant, but it was sometime in September or October that she realized that she had missed her periods taken the test, learned she was pregnant, and ultimately gave birth to a stillborn baby on either February 22nd or February 23rd of 1993. You'll hear testimony about this photo. That's her boyfriend to the right. Well, let's start with that's Gail in the pink, marching in the parade for the Lyndhurst Home Day Parade sometime in the middle of September of '92. And that's her boyfriend, later to be husband, Mark Ritchie, to the right. And you're going to hear testimony from a number of witnesses that Gail never told anybody that she was pregnant, and nobody in her life saw or noticed that she was pregnant. Not her mom and dad, with whom she lived with. And both of them would see and interact with her on a daily basis during the entire period of her pregnancy, and they never noticed. Not her sister, who lived in the same house, who shared a bedroom with Gail for the entire period of her pregnancy and never noticed. Not her boyfriend, Mark Ritchie, with whom she would see on a regular basis. Again, over this entire time period we're talking about, never noticed, never saw her as pregnant. Not David Cantor and his wife Mary Ellen, that would see her every day, 5 days a week. First thing in the morning, and later in the evening when they would come home from work, every day during the entire period of time of her pregnancy, never saw her as pregnant. Not her doctor, not her friends in the church, not any of the girls or young ladies that participated in the church youth group that she would see several times a week, every week, over the entire period of her pregnancy, and never saw her as pregnant. Not anybody in the community saw or noticed that Gail was pregnant. And so what you have is Gail, isolated and alone, nobody to talk to, nobody to confide in, alone in a group of people in her world. Nobody saw her as pregnant, and neither did Gail. So the stillborn baby was born on either Monday, the 22nd of February, or Tuesday, February 23rd, again of 1993. You're going to hear testimony that this is the kitchen of the home in Shaker Heights that David Cantor and his wife Mary Ellen lived in, and where Gail went to work as a full-time nanny during the entire time period at issue. You'll hear more testimony that right off the kitchen towards the back, you take a couple steps down, turn a right, and you're into the half bath. There's another straight-on photo, and you'll see that the ceiling is somewhat slanted, and right above on the second floor is the bedroom where the young girl who was having her quiet time was upstairs playing, reading, whatever she was doing. And as was typical, the young girl would always keep her door open so that Gail could hear if there was any issue or problem. And Gail initially felt, as I said, the need to have this bowel movement. And so when she sat down on the toilet, she left the door open so that she could hear if there was any issue with the young girl upstairs. And then you'll hear testimony that Camp Koinonia hosted this church retreat later in that week. Let me go back here for a minute. So, as I said, when Gail sat down on that toilet, she had no idea she was giving birth. She felt the need to push once she sat down. And that's exactly what she did. It was an uncontrollable urge. And it was a very short period of time. And she had no contractions. She never felt her water break. There was no real significant pain. Very little blood. As I said, within 15 to 30 minutes, the baby, the umbilical cord, and the placenta all came out and into the toilet. Didn't make a sound, didn't move. And as I described earlier, she was scared. She cleaned up, put a couple rags in her crotch. Didn't know what to do. Put the stillborn baby's body into that garbage bag, into the trunk. It sat there for the next several days. She didn't know what to do. And then the church retreat. You'll hear testimony from the pastor that hosted and organized this church retreat. And there's the date of the retreat, February 26th through the 28th. You'll hear testimony that Camp Koinonia, which is in Geneva, is maybe a couple miles from Sidley Road, where the body was found. So the evidence that you're going to hear over these next several days, including but not limited to expert medical testimony from Gail Ritchie herself, that this was in fact a stillborn baby, not born alive, stillborn. And the evidence that you're going to see, as I've already indicated, that need for a bowel movement. She had no idea she was giving birth. No contractions, no pain, very little bleeding. Never saw the baby move, never heard the baby make a sound. She didn't experience any lactation afterwards. Her breast didn't produce any milk. All of that evidence will clearly establish, contrary to what the state has alleged, that this was a stillborn birth. Now, as you heard from the prosecutor described, they take a different position. And they say, oh, we can prove this was a live birth. And their entire case rests on the head of the pin that are these 3 microscopic tissue slides of the lung tissue taken from the baby's body at the time of the autopsy back in 1993. And you're going to hear significant testimony about the pathology of the lung, how it is that, we come to breathe, how air makes its way from our lungs down the trachea, into the bronchial tubes, into the lungs, and then ultimately makes its way into the bloodstream. And it's all through these alveoli, which are tiny microscopic tissue in everybody's lungs. We all have them. And they're oftentimes, you're going to hear from some of the medical experts, generally loosely described as like bundles of grapes. And there's very thin membranes on each grape that allows for the transfer of oxygen that we breathed in through our lungs into the bloodstream. And again, there's 150 million alveoli, on average, in one single lung. 150 million. So just tiny microscopic pieces of tissue. And these bronchial tubes that come from off of our trachea and into our lungs, just create more and more branches. And at the end of each of those branches are these bundles of alveoli. And that you're going to hear testimony that when a baby is in the mother's womb, they're not breathing oxygen. And so these alveoli are, much like a deflated balloon. The tissues are all pushed together. And that when a baby is born and they start breathing, and oxygen essentially inflates these alveoli. And you'll hear from the state's medical expert that he examined these 3 tissue slides and saw evidence that some of these alveoli had been expanded, and thus the conclusion that the baby must have taken 1 or more breaths, and thus this wasn't a stillborn, this was a live birth. So you'll hear that the state's medical expert, Dr. Philo, didn't actually perform the autopsy. It was obviously performed in 1993. And Dr. Philo was not involved in preparing these 3 tissue slides. He never had the benefit of talking to Dr. Challoner specifically about this case, and really never personally examined the body. And he's relying largely on what he can read from the original autopsy report and these 3 tissue slides. And you'll hear Dr. Philo talk about he has experience performing thousands of autopsies. And he's taken countless tissue samples from different organs in the body, including the lungs, and various people that he's performed an autopsy on over probably 30 years. And he's going to explain to you that these pathological processes that I'm describing about when, for example, a baby is first born and they start taking breaths and the air comes down the trach into these bronchial tubes and starts expanding these alveoli, that it doesn't occur uniformly. And that's why it's important to take as many samples of lung tissue from different parts of both lungs and from different parts in any one lung to ensure that you are getting an accurate, objective view of all of the lung tissues. And Dr. Philo will tell you that didn't happen here. That there, first of all, was only one lung here. The body, as we have already heard, was exposed in the elements for some 30 plus days. And when it was discovered, it was apparent that it had been badly mutilated, no doubt by animal activity. And that, a number of the organs were missing. The left lung missing. So there was only one lung here. And when Dr. Challoner first performed the autopsy back in 1993, he only took 3 samples that would represent a tiny fraction of the total lung tissue in that one remaining lung. And he never documented where he took the lung tissue samples from. It's never documented in the autopsy report. So Dr. Philo will tell you that if he were performing the autopsy, well, in general, he would take at least 10 or more samples from both lungs in a typical situation. But in a case like this, where the critical issue was this baby born alive? And given the fact that there was only one lung available for examination, that he would have examined the entire lung tissue. But that didn't happen. So we've talked a little bit, you're going to hear testimony about the birth taking place February 22nd or February 23rd. And we've already talked a little bit about, you're going to hear testimony that Camp Koinonia was later that week of February, the 26th, 27th, and 28th. And it was either the 26th or 27th when Gail left the camp, drove a few miles down the road, and left the bag that had the body and the placenta still inside, and drove away. And it was not discovered until March 25th. So the body was exposed to the elements for over a month, badly mutilated by animals who eventually dragged it into the road where it had been run over by a car. You're going to hear testimony about some of these photographs that were taken on March 25th of '93. This is the area on Sidley Road in Thompson Township where the body was discovered. This is just another photograph also of Sidley Road. You can see the tape up there, and the body is lying in the road just beyond that yellow tape. You can see that there's snow on the ground, but the roadway's wet and muddy. You'll hear the temperature on this particular day was some 45 degrees. You can see the snow starting to melt. You can see the mutilated body laying in the road, badly damaged, starting to decompose, mutilated by animals. You'll see that the next day, the autopsy was performed by Dr. Challoner, the Geauga County Coroner's Office. You'll hear testimony regarding Dr. Challoner's autopsy report, where it will be described that there was the left lung was the subject of an avulsion, which is, to be graphic, just torn out by an animal. And you'll hear more testimony about the condition of the body. Again, numerous abrasions, organs missing, flesh eaten, bones were exposed. The body was in terrible condition. More evidence that you'll be presented with, documenting that the kidneys were gone, the spleen was gone, the left lung was gone. The right lung weighed 31 grams, 28 grams in an ounce, 31 grams, we're talking 1 ounce. The stump of the umbilical cord was still attached, exposed and ragged. You'll hear Dr. Philo critique Dr. Challoner's autopsy report that will acknowledge that there's an incomplete and vague anatomical description of the one remaining lung. You'll hear why that's relevant and important. You'll hear that there's no even mention in the autopsy report about these 3 tissue slides, how they were prepared, more importantly, from what locations in the lung they were taken from. So none of that tissue was available to Dr. Philo. Hence, it's so important to rely on a detailed and accurate, thorough autopsy report, and that doesn't exist here. So, again, back to this map, and we've talked a little bit about the 30 plus days that this body was exposed into the elements. And that becomes highly important in this case. Because we talked a little bit earlier about these alveoli that are like a deflated balloon, again, 150 million of them, right, in that lung. And that they are natural body. When a baby's born, you take in breaths and they can expand. And there was some evidence of that in these 3 tissue slides. But as we've talked about, these 3 tissue slides really only show the tiniest of a fraction of these lung tissues, of the entire lung tissue. And we've already talked about how these processes of our body don't happen uniformly. And you're also going to hear that there's other ways that these alveoli can become expanded. And one is through decomposition. That decomposition, particularly in this case when you have evidence of animal activity and there's saliva that puts bacteria into the body, can generate in decomposition, which can form gases, which in turn expand these alveoli. And you're going to hear expert testimony that there's no way to determine if these expanded alveoli are as a result of breathing, for example, or decomposition, or other reasons that you'll hear discussed at length from that witness stand. Part of the autopsy report, and you'll hear testimony about this, includes these climatological records that, in simple terms, document on a daily basis during the entire month of February and March of 1993 what the high and low temperatures were every single day. There's February, there's March, and like a typical time, February and March in Geauga County, the temperatures certainly fluctuated, and there were certainly days when it was below freezing, which would in turn naturally slow down that decomposition process. But there were a number of days when the temperatures were in the low to mid 40s, including the last 5 days leading up to the discovery of the body. And you'll hear expert testimony that there had to be decomposition because that body is exposed to the elements, to the bacteria from the animal activity, to the temperatures in the low to mid 40s for over a month. The body starts decomposing when we die. And that process just continues, just as it did here, for more than a month. So you'll recall that slide I showed you earlier that had the big blue triangle and resting on these 3 slides. That's the only evidence that the state's going to present to you to argue that this was not a stillborn baby, but in fact a live birth. That's the only evidence. And we have some, but not all, of the alveoli in those microscopic slides are expanded. But there's no way to distinguish if that was from a breath or if that was from decomposition or from the animal activity itself. It's graphic, but it's necessary that you'll hear expert testimony that an animal chewing on and eating the left lung, it necessarily, both lungs are connected, serves as like a billow, like a fireplace billow, pushing air into the other lung. So there's multiple reasons where some of these alveoli would be expanded. And for all of the reasons that were on one of my earlier slides, we know this was a stillborn baby. No contractions, no water broke, no lactation, no pain, such a short birth. The baby didn't move, the baby didn't make a sound. Let me switch gears, talk a little bit more talk a little bit more about Gail's life growing up and why she didn't tell anybody that she was pregnant. This is a photo. You'll hear testimony about this. Gail in the upper left-hand corner, her sister Nancy on the right, her dad Harvey, and her mother Nancy down front. This was taken for the church directory in the spring of 1993, a month or two after she birthed the stillborn baby. You'll hear testimony. This is Gail's father. You'll hear testimony about this photograph and a lot more about her father. He was an alcoholic, verbally and emotionally abusive to both Gail and her sister. And you'll hear testimony from Gail's sister that when she reflects back on growing up, she remembers the smoking, 2 packs of Pall Malls a day, the drinking, and the yelling. He would belittle them, demean them. You'll hear from Gail herself that her dad never made her feel loved, never hugged her, never made her feel like anything she could ever do was good enough. Called her fat. Discouraged her from studying. Why? You'll never be anything anyway. That just created feelings of low self-esteem, low self-worth. It was a very cold household. They would have family dinners and there'd be very little discussion except for her father ranting that no daughter of mine will ever have a child out of wedlock because his sister did. That was so hard for him to accept. And that would never happen to one of his daughters. You'll hear testimony from Gail and her sister that their mom never protected them, never intervened, allowed and enabled her dad, to beat them down. So the Lyndhurst Baptist Church has always been a big part of her life. And when she was in the 3rd grade, she always saw a family, a neighbor family. They had 2 young children right around Gail's age, would always walk by their house. She eventually learned they were going to church. And Gail wanted to do that too. Largely because it would get her out of the house on Sundays when her dad was home. So she attended the Lyndhurst Baptist Church starting in the 3rd grade all the way through to all times relevant here. Eventually became leader of the church youth group. You'll hear testimony about these photographs. These are taken from some of these church retreats I've talked about a little bit. And you'll see the yellow circles depict the young man and the young woman that were in the 3rd grade walking by Gail's house and remained members of the church as well, became friends with Gail, went on these retreats with Gail. You hear some testimony about some of these photographs when Gail was in high school. Picture of Gail alone at her high school graduation. This is Gail at her Sweet 16 birthday party when she was allowed to take one person with her to a dinner to celebrate, and she had been interested in Mark Ritchie, but he didn't show a lot of interest in her, and she's the one who pushed that along and invited him to this dinner, and that began this relationship that eventually ended up in marriage. There's Mark and Gail together. You'll hear testimony about this slide. That's Gail's younger sister at her high school graduation, and she was always the, at least in Gail's eyes, the favored child. And then we're back to this picture of Gail at her sister's graduation. And even though this Gail is the one that is on trial here today, it's that Gail and what she was thinking and feeling and the decisions she made that you have to judge. We already saw this picture. That's from September of '93. Gail and her family in the spring of, I misspoke, that was September of '92. This is a photo from September of '93. And there you'll see Gail, and you'll hear Gail talk about that she felt isolated and alone. Never felt secure in her relationship with Mark. Never felt that could he really love me? Is he really going to commit to me? Is he really going to stay with me? No doubt from years of her dad's emotional abuse beating down her self-esteem and self-worth. Couldn't tell her dad. Go crazy. Couldn't tell her mom because her mom would tell her dad. Really didn't have much of a close relationship with her sister to this day. Couldn't tell her sister. Couldn't tell Mark. Afraid she'd leave him. Couldn't tell anybody. So there she is, alone and isolated, scared to death. Can't accept that she's in fact pregnant. So ultimately, that is the Gail Ritchie that you're going to be judging. The choices and decisions she made. You'll hear her testify, as I said, and you'll hear her express regret and remorse for how she disposed of this baby's body. You'll hear her talk about, what it was like growing up in her home. You'll hear how she has a very difficult time expressing herself emotionally, no doubt because she was so beaten down by her father. You'll hear how she has a very difficult time even talking badly about anybody, including her father. But ultimately, what matters most is that she's charged with murder and aggravated murder here. Purposely causing the death. And the evidence and testimony will be overwhelmingly clear that this baby was never born alive. She didn't do anything to purposely cause the death. This was a stillborn baby. And under those circumstances, your verdict can only be not guilty. And at the conclusion of this trial, that's exactly what we're going to ask you to do here, is return verdicts of not guilty to both counts in this indictment. With that, I thank you very much for your time. Thank you, Judge.
Thank you, Mr. Bradley. All right, we're going to, did you have something, Mr. Bradley? I'm sorry. Well, actually, what I thought was, since we've been at it for approximately an hour, that we would take a brief 10-minute recess now. This one, won't be allowed to leave the courthouse or anything. The jurors, you'll remain in the jury room, but it'll give you a chance to stretch, and I'm not sure, I think coffee's probably back there. So I repeat those instructions we went over many times. You're still not to discuss the case amongst yourselves, even though you've heard at least opening statements now. You're not to form any opinions yet until you hear all the evidence. You're not to talk to anybody. You're not to do any research on your own. And no one is to be talking to you. So if that happens again, let us know. And otherwise, I think we